Tim, what is it that you like about Australia right now?
Not the cricket. I've been buying in Australia for more than a decade now. I know that market really, really well. And the currency, in that time, the currency's gone from being very weak to very strong and, of course, back again. So there are lots of things, but fundamentally, the currency's a really great buy at the moment. It's a very cheap time. So I like the currency play in Australia. That and a whole host of other things, like interest rates have come down to the lowest level since 1960, and it's finally looking like a good yield play, which traditionally Aussie has never been a great yield play, I have to say.
So if you're looking to buy in Australia, where in Australia would you buy?
I'd be buying in Sydney and Melbourne primarily. I'm not a great fan of the kind of Gold Coast investment strategy. I can understand why people do that, but for me, you always concentrate on the main cities. Supply levels are so tight in Australia. You've got the best districts of Sydney and Melbourne. They're virtually zero vacancy rates there, and that's what I like about those cities. And if you buy in the best suburbs, you'll always get good yields as well.
There have been great rises in the last decade or so in areas that have benefited from the resources boom, Perth, for example. Should you be wary now, though, to go into areas which were essentially puffed up by the commodities boom?
It's very interesting, isn't it? Sydney and Melbourne really had their day in sort of the late 90s to the early 2000s, and Perth property market never really did very much. And then, of course, the commodity boom kicked in, and I actually bought in Perth and sold again before that I kind of ran out of steam. So that's very much a cyclical play with Perth, whereas Sydney and Melbourne are very much, proper financial services markets. And what people don't realise is that those markets have grown very little in the last 5 years. And that's why we like them. There isn't that froth on the market that you're seeing around the world. It hasn't got the UK 30-40% in a couple of years. It's really been quite steady Eddie for the last few years.
Australia, though, does have one of the highest prices for property relative to the average wage. Surely that is some sort of warning sign that property prices are still too high.
You have to look at the mentality of Aussies, though. I mean, Australians love property. They love to buy property. They buy for themselves, their kids, as soon as they can afford to. So that will always keep that market interesting. Liquidity will always be good. In Sydney in September 2008, it took 31 days on average to sell your apartment. That's September 2008. We're in the eye of the storm. I think that was the month Lehman went under, and it only takes 31 days to sell your apartment. And they're not cheap in Sydney, we know that. People will pay for property there. People want their own properties. And people will rent them too until they can afford to buy. So it seems to be self-perpetuating, that market. Of course, in Melbourne you pay 30% less, but this last 12 months have been very, very interesting. Rentals have gone up by on average 25% in Sydney and 12% in Melbourne. So people are paying a premium to rent until they can afford to buy. And of course, interest rates now are the lowest they've been since 1960. So the market makes sense to me.
Are there properties in Australia that you would avoid?
There are definitely properties I'd avoid, and I've made mistakes in the past. I mean, I've bought in these very high-rise, off-plan deals in South Bank in Melbourne, and Aussies don't tend to buy those properties. I mean, they're very much investor plays. I like blocks of 12, 15 units in the best districts of these cities. That's what the locals buy, and that's what the locals like to rent. And for liquidity purposes, that's what you should be buying. We have to remember there's not tight supply of land in Australia. So, these big high-rises that people will buy in Asia, they don't buy them in Australia. So I definitely would avoid that in the future.
So if there's so much land in Australia, what is it that's driving the market and you think is going to continue to drive the market?
Well, here's the conundrum. There's not a tight supply of land, but there's a tight supply of land in the areas where everybody wants to live. You take the east coast of Sydney, for instance, or you take places like Melbourne Port Melbourne, St Kilda. It's very tight there. They're little old one-storey buildings. They're knocking them down now and building 6 flats, 8 flats, and that's where people want to live and people want to rent. So there's a tight supply of land in those great areas, and that's where we're going to be buying. Surrey Hills in Sydney, as I say, St Kilda in Melbourne, maybe Port Melbourne. Those are great areas to live. I mean, my brother's been there for 12 years. I know those areas very well, and that's where I'd be investing.